She left the police. She absconded from the police with Tom. They moved to, I think it was Dorset. She took part in one of the largest Animal Liberation Front mink liberation raids down in Dorset or somewhere like that, freeing about 6,000 mink. She then went public saying that she had been a police spy. She apologized publicly to the people she'd been spying on, saying they were some of the best people that she'd ever met. And then the Met Police issued a counter to that. They were pissed off with her. She had publicly and disgracefully quit the police force and made public the fact that she was a spy. So the police were shitting themselves, thinking she could be telling all these Hunsabs or anarchists all the inner workings of how the whole British spy thing works and all this. She knows it all. She was one of them.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm back today with somebody I'm excited to talk to because we're going to talk about animal rights and the history of the animal rights. Well, the ALF, which we know a good friend Ronnie Lee founded the ALF, Animal Liberation Front. We've got Mark Fitzpatrick. How you doing?
I'm very well. How are you, Chris?
I'm pretty good. So you work with the Vegan Society down in New Zealand, but you're from Ireland originally.
So I'm Irish. I'm from Cork City, which is down the very south. And I got involved in animal rights probably in my mid-teens. There was a very small, barely existent movement in Ireland at the time, and still now, I guess, although it's probably bigger. But when I moved to the UK, it being a much more mature and bigger scene for various reasons, I got really involved in the anarcho-punk and animal rights movement over there many years. Then moved over here 10 years ago. I dropped out of activism for about 5 years, starting a family, etc. Then I decided I had a bit more time on my hands, and the Vegan Society were looking for people to join their board. So I applied and been with them on the Vegan Society board of New Zealand for about 5 years. And I specialize in the public outreach program. So I organize a rolling series of lectures and events to help publicize veganism and the Vegan Society, mainly in libraries around Auckland, but I help coordinate it around the country as well. So that's.
Are you yourself vegan?
I've been vegan for many, many years, since I was about 18, I think, since I left home, essentially. So since about 18, I went vegetarian when I was about 13, then vegan as soon as I could, which was, I think, 18. And then there was a lapse of about 8 years that was prompted by a trip to India, right? And I got really, really weak. I went to India for about 6 months on my own when I was 30, just traveling around. I don't know if you've ever been to India, but it really blows your mind. It's a really extreme place. Everything around, the climate, the culture, the colors, the smells, it's all very different. And I began to get very weak, and I blamed it on, I succumbed to the lack of protein myth that you always hear when you're vegetarian and vegan. Where do you get your protein from? And I was waking up really weak and staying really weak all day in India. And I was thinking, maybe this is a lack of protein. Maybe all those guys who were saying that I need to eat eggs and cheese for protein are right. I'm going to have to give it a go, because I can't think of any other way to get energized. So I began to consume mainly cheese then for about 8 years. There was no milk and there's very few eggs, but there was cheese. And I maintained eating cheese for about 8 years. And then I was reading a book by a guy called Yuval Noah Harari. And he was talking about animal experiments and comparing that to the dairy industry. And from that, I was shaving at the time in a campsite, and I was listening to him on the audiobook, and I was like, right, I've been fooling myself completely for 8 years. I was really ashamed and embarrassed about what I had been doing. And me and the family went vegan from that point on, that day on. I had a talk with my wife, and we decided this is unacceptable. If we claim to be concerned about animal welfare, we cannot be partaking in the dairy industry in any form. Yeah. And we decided to go vegan then. We had 2 young kids, and I was concerned. And looking back, all of my concerns, this is all hangover stuff that you hear repeatedly from other people who don't know what they're talking about when they find out that you're vegan or vegetarian. You know, if you're pregnant, you need meat or cheese or whatever. If you're a young kid, you have to have milk or fish or whatever it is. All of that is nonsense. I really went into the long grasp with it to make sure that I wasn't inflicting harm on my kids. And but since then, we've been vegan, and I would say to anyone out there who's considering going vegan or vegetarian, who's concerned about this, the easiest and most definitive way of making sure that you're okay, and this is something that I do with my kids every year, is get a blood test and ask the pharmacy or the doctor to look for a whole lot of telling variables. So your cholesterol level, your protein levels, your all the lipids and all the rest of it. So you can see exactly where you stand in terms of your nutritional balance in your body. And that will tell you if you need to eat more or less of any specific things. And then you can rest assured that you're okay. So I'm rambling, and I'm going to be rambling.
No, and this is fine. This is fine.
So
you can come back next week. We'll do it again if we didn't get everything.
Okay.
So when you were a little bit weak and sick, and you said I got to eat cheese, and then you started eating cheese, did it fix your malady?
I don't really recall. I've tried to think back. It was so long ago now. I don't recall it doing anything significantly so, because the science of my thinking was flawed. I mean, there wasn't anything that I was going to get from cheese that I wasn't getting from any of the other foods that I was eating. I think maybe it might have had a mental thing, you know, that thing where you think you're taking a thing and you feel you're getting better.
Placebo effect.
I think it had a placebo effect probably, because I was so convinced that from everyone else saying, oh, cheese is full of protein, have that, you feel good, that there was probably a placebo effect, but that was all I would say. But because cheese is addictive, because it's got morphine in it, which I didn't know at the time, that's why I was taking drugs in the form of cheese rather than eating food. You know what I mean? So that's a very interesting thing about the whole cheese things, and people immediately assume that you're lying when you say this, because it sounds a bit outlandish. Obviously, they can check it in an instant on their phone. So why the vegan community would be positing this as a concern if it wasn't true is beyond me. But yeah, it's caseomorphine. Morphine is attached to the proteins in cheese. It's about 10% the potency of medical morphine, which might not sound much, but if you're having that every day in your sandwiches, that's quite a lot of morphine, you know, and it's enough to build up an addiction. And that's the idea of it. It's to keep infants calm and coming back for more.
Wow.
So, you know, if you've ever been around a breastfeeding infant, after they've had a feed, they look like they're unconscious, that they're in a coma. They're drugged up. That's what it is. They've had a lot of morphine, and they are like, they've been filled up with sort of the lovely feeling that gives you, you know. So Jerry
laid back on the couch with the cigarette.
Yeah, I know. So cheese is drugs rather than food, or it's as much drugs as it is food. So, but yeah, so I've been back to vegan again for about 6 or 7 years. I've never felt better. There's more and more science that's coming out now, confirming the benefits of the plant-based diet. So I have no more fears around that. That was always lurking at the back of my mind until I actually bothered to inform myself seriously about it. And I know now that I'm on a really healthy diet, and so are my kids. It's the only diet that's been proven to reverse heart disease. So not just calm it down, but to stop and reverse heart disease. So it's a no-brainer these days.
Yeah.
And I get increasingly frustrated with people who don't come to their senses around this. If they're not prepared to pick the lowest hanging fruit in terms of addressing ecological breakdown, then they're not going to do the harder things. And adapting your diet for survival reasons should be a no-brainer. But it's still a very hard fight. I realize different countries have different cultures and approaches and responses to this. But in New Zealand, it's quite dairy, lots of beef. The economy is maybe not dependent on it, but about half the economy is sort of from animal agriculture. In terms of the environmental impacts it has, the dairy industry has essentially killed almost all the rivers in this country. Something like 70 or 80% of all the rivers in New Zealand are polluted beyond being able to touch because of nitrates, because of the dairy industry. So they're shitting on the environment here, and they're still seen as heroes. And to try and cut through that before it's too late is the objective and a very hard thing to do.
And I think that one of the gateways to breaking this is the misinformation and the myths and the stuff like this. Oh, you'll die. Oh, your protein. Oh, this, that, and the other. People need
Yeah.
specific, and they have the phone. They can go and look it up. Oh, it's ruining the world. Oh, it's actually good for me. This is one of the
Yeah.
biggest, cons that's probably ever
Yeah.
been pulled over on people, is this idea that we need to
Yeah.
keep going with this whole thing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. So when did you have a vegan community at the beginning, like when you went vegan originally, or were you just out there on your own trying to make dietary decisions in the dark?
There was a few of us. So I went to art college. I left home at about 18 and I went to art college in a different city in Ireland. And I met with there was 3 or 4 of the people there who were punks who were vegan as well, or who were starting to go vegan because now they left home and they have the opportunity to do so. So looking back, we had no nutritional information. We didn't seek any out really. We sort of went by what we decided was common sense and our taste buds. But yeah, so it was a very basic diet. It probably wasn't bad. There was lots of potatoes and peas, and there was a type of vegan alternative sausage called sauce mix. I don't know. It was like a powder. You buy it in a bag, and it's just like a brown gravy granular powder. You add water to it, and you make it into shapes, and then you can fry up your sausage and your burger. They're actually really nice.
Oh, really? Okay.
Still around, yeah, and they're probably just full of salt and sugar and stuff.
Okay.
But they were really nice. But it was a very basic diet. We were all stumbling around, trying to find the best ways and the cheapest ways of doing this. But being young and naive and gung ho, we could get away with not being that accurate with the old nourishment and the nutritional aspect of things. Our bodies would sort of take it. As I've got older, I realized the importance of a good diet now, but at the time it was very much, it was political rather than dietary. We talked for hours about the politics, about what crafts we're doing, about what class war we're doing, or Ronnie Lee was doing, and very little about nutrition and why eating broccoli is good.
That's punk rock, man.
That is punk rock. So we were driving on politics and fury and a sense of righteousness and despair and all that, rather than it being a health thing. In fact, if you had sat me down at the time and pressed me on it, I'd have probably told you that the vegan diet may not be good for you. I'm not sure if it is or not. I'm not sure if I'm missing out on things, but I'm prepared to take a bit of a hit for the sake of the animals, basically. Now I'm glad to say, obviously, that being a vegan is the best thing that you can be in terms of health. It guarantees you, if you do it right, something like you have a 30% less chance of getting a whole host of the top killers in modern society, the cardiovascular diseases and so on. So, I'm pleased to say it's the best thing that you can do. At the time, I had no idea of that.
Yeah.
When you listen to a conflict record, it's about the ALF and about hunsabbing. It's not about nutritional advice,
That's why I hope in my old age, when I was young and rebellious and was a troublemaker, broke the law, was bad in some sense in the cultural norms, to get older and realize not only were you not wrong, you were extremely right.
You were cutting edge.
Right.
You were what people in generations ahead of us would be looking back on as, in a sense, sort of folk heroes, I hope. If we're still around, then we will be. People who are doing this now, we're different from the mainstream of society, and what we're doing is in the name of the future, and that isn't realized right now, but in time it will be. I think.
Yeah, it's a slow process to change the minds of the dullards and the status quo kind of zombies out there. And the authority really has to come through with a narrative on to tell them, because they only get a lot of their information from. But friends of friends, friends of family. Slowly we get the message across, I hope.
Yes.
So what about your journey with animals itself? Because in the 70s and there's all this. You could pick punk rock in so many different forms. You could social justice and stuff. What led you to animals?
I think I had an intuitive response to cruelty, I think. Whenever I witnessed it, or sort of wanton dumping of rubbish, stuff like that, just sort of small stuff that you would see as a child, that always irked me. It was a very nebulous sort of reaction. There wasn't anything firm. I didn't really know where it came from or what to do with it. But it was just a natural instinctive reaction to what I considered cruelty or destruction of nature. When I was in my very early teens, I got into Iron Maiden and heavy metal. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who was really into punk at the time, and we were sort of comparing the two in terms of music and the heaviness and all that. And I remember saying to him, I really like the Iron Maiden music, but the stuff they sing about, a lot of it, I was maybe 14 at the time, thinking, oh, Dungeons and Dragons and Satan and hell and stuff like this. It's a bit silly, but the music's good. And the guy that was listening to this was really into Crass, and he was saying, well, if you like heavy music and stuff with lyrics that mean something, I'll bring some albums in for you tomorrow. And God bless me, did. He came in with the whole Crass back catalogue and one of Conflict's albums, right? About 6 or 7 albums. And he goes, take these home, give them back in a week's time, but listen to these. And so I remember flicking through them, and obviously all the Crass album covers are black and white and quite stark and hard to look at almost, And then I came across the Conflict album. They have an album called The Ungovernable Force, and it was brightly coloured, and it was a policeman pointing a rubber bullet gun at this camera, and it was really evocative. And I put on that album, and I remember sitting down on my bed, just being blown away from that. I mean, it was so fast and furious, and I was reading through the words, and it was also everything I wanted to hear was being blasted at me at 1,000 miles an hour by Conflict, and the music was perfect and chaotic, but still tight, and really good rhythms and melodies, and the lyrics were so insightful and interesting, and basically the nebulous ideas I had began to really crystallize and form into what was then, I suppose, a form of green anarchism in terms of politics, with a heavy emphasis on animal rights and a heavy emphasis on direct action in animal rights. So it blew my mind. I was the only person who was really into it that I knew at the time. But then at the age of about 16 or 17, I started to meet people in Cork City who were really into the music as well. So there was a small group of anarcho-punks in the late 80s who I gravitated towards for the very obvious reasons that I've outlined. And we ended up forming bands and putting up fanzines and all of this. And it was brilliant. It was a tiny, thriving, really positive DIY, proactive little scene where we would play random pubs around Cork City, usually with other bands, other punk bands, to our friends and maybe some of their friends, small audiences, but we were so into it and it was so much fun, and it really gave us good direction. So we were inspired by, and we used to sing about the ALF and what Ronnie Lee was doing and all that. There was a small amount of activity going on in Cork at the time. I was never involved in that. My involvement in the direct action scene was purely with the Hunt sabotage movement, which came a little bit later. But there was small articles in local media about that 15 butcher shops being smashed by Smiths fans on one given small scale things. But at the time, there was a lot of weight given to them because no one could believe that anyone would do anything like that in the name of animal rights. It was just beyond most people's comprehension. The most that they could grasp was if they owned a pet and they liked that pet, and someone decided to come along and kick that pet dog, they would then get angry and maybe stand up and be emotive then. But outside of that very narrow sorts of metaphorical situation, the idea of doing anything for animals, for chickens in a factory farm or for pigs, was ludicrous. Probably a sign of mental illness, I think a lot of people thought. Certainly a slap in the face of Catholicism, which subtly preaches dominion, which is the human supremacist notion that we are different from, separate from nature and from animals, that we aren't animals ourselves, and that we can do anything we want to them because they're things. They're like chairs or phones or something. You own them. This is a very pervasive ideology. It's everywhere you go, but Catholicism really drives that home, because the whole point is that Jesus was a man, and a man can't be an animal if Jesus was one of them. It's this convoluted, ridiculous idea of separation from nature, and it allows all these atrocities to happen.
Yeah.
So in the book, I describe, so the Irish government, the Irish state, the Irish Free State as it stands at the moment has been in existence for 1 century. It came into existence in 1923 after the revolution. This is 2023. So for the first, I would say, 80 plus years of the state's existence, it was as much to do with a type of fascism as it was to do with its professed system of democratic society. So all the boxes that you would tick in a fascist society were there in our hysterical anti-communism, anti-feminism, anti-individuality, highly anti-intellectual. You do not ask priests any questions. They tell you what to do. You don't question this. Really anti-left, anti-union, highly nationalist, really Catholic. It was overwhelmingly, almost, I would say, in the Republic would be 98% white and Catholic, maybe even more. Up until this is all up until the cracks that began to show in the mid 1990s, I would say. So when I was growing up as a teenager in the late 80s, 90s, and the movement that came out of our society, it came out of a society that was a type of parochial fascism, very similar to Franco's Spain or Portugal during its fascist times. So it was a non-expansionist fascism. It didn't want to invade any other countries. It couldn't anyway. It barely had an army. But it was a very right-wing, at the very least you could describe it would be as arch-conservative, bleeding into a type of fascism. It wouldn't have described itself as fascist, but it bore so many hallmarks of that it's an unavoidable comparison to make, at least to a certain extent. I would say to a very large extent. It's changed now. The country has changed unbelievable. I haven't been back there for about 30 years living, but I've kept my eye on the social progress of the place. And it is really stunning to see the falling away of that old system and that old consensus. It still exists and it's still very strong there. It's probably still the mainstream, but it's slipping away. Yeah. So in terms of the amount of people who attend church or the amount of people who are non-white or who are openly gay, it's really changed now. In fact, the Prime Minister of Ireland now is an openly gay, half Indian man, which is unbelievable.
Cool.
To think. Coincidentally, the leader of the UK is also half Indian or an Indian man. He's not gay, but the British Isles, Ireland and England have changed tremendously since the 80s, 90s. I would say the 90s more.
Well, you grew up in the Margaret Thatcher days?
Yes, yeah. So Thatcher was in power when I was growing up. There was a really bitter struggle going on between the IRA and Thatcher and the Tories. That sucked up all the oxygen in the room. So the news was dominated on TV at night time or in the media, the printed media. It was dominated by what Sinn Féin or what the IRA were doing. Very other few protest movements or left-wing movements had a chance of getting an airing because what they were doing in comparison to the IRA was so newsworthy, But it did exist. I traced it back to the start of the 1980s when the Animal Liberation Front began operations in Ireland, and in 1990 when the Hunt sabotage movement began. So it's been going ever since. But as I said earlier, it reached an apex over a 20-year period, and it's been subsiding for the last 10 years. There's still a Hunt sabotage movement. A illegal direct action movement, not really. It's still there, but tiny numbers and very inactive in comparison.
So what do you attribute to this fall in participation in Hunt sabotage? Are we doing better with legislation? No, obviously not.
There's a number of reasons. So you could start with the massive prison sentences that were handed out to the likes of Ronnie Lee and Keith Mann during the end of the 80s and the 90s. And that scared a lot of people. I mean, yeah. Keith Mann got 18 years or something, or 14 years. Barry Horn got something similar. Massive sentences that you wouldn't get for killing someone, So that scared a lot of people off. The ubiquity of CCTV and other forms of security these days. I couldn't imagine stuff that I was reading about and compiling from the 80s and 90s happening today. Going into a city at night time and chucking a brick through a fur shop window and just running off. That was probably an easy enough thing to do in the 80s and 90s. You just turn a corner and stop running, and then you're away really. These days, there would be CCTV following you right to your door. I would imagine, and it would just be impossible to do that for any length of time and get away with it. So there's increased security. massive increase in state suppression. The spy network that was revealed from about 2010 on blew everyone's mind. No one thought that the state were that interested in us. The movement was absolutely penetrated with spies right up to the top. And we never thought that we were anywhere near of a threat enough to the state for them to even be aware of our existence, barely. Not a mind to be sending people in for 5 or 10 years and having babies with activists and allegedly setting fire to fur department stores themselves and all this stuff. I mean, the length and breadth of that spying campaign over a 40-year period by the British state, it's unbelievable. It's worthy of a really good movie. And that was another reason why they knew everything that we were doing.
Oh, so these basically these documents got leaked about all the spy programs in the Western world, basically that during that time, and they did confirm that you guys were under surveillance, or these two groups.
Oh yes, yeah. So particularly with the Hunt saboteurs, when I was living in England from 1996, I was sabotaging hunts up until the ban in 2004. And I was with a group called the Chiltern Hunt Sabs. Chiltern is an area north of London. So we were the Chiltern Hunt Sabs, and we would team up with the West London Hunt Sabs to do joint hits on various hunts around the region. One of their members was a woman who was known by the name of Christine Green, who was one of the few female undercover cops, and she had penetrated the West London Hunt Sabs and was going out sabbing with us. We all knew her as Christine, very feisty, often getting into fights with hunters. Really good at driving. So she'd often drive these narrow country lanes in a Land Rover with a lot of sabs in the back, and she's pelting it down, getting away from police or chasing hunts. They're all given special driving skills as cops, you see. So she had these skills, and she had transport and money and time and energy to spend spying on us, pretending to be a hunt sab. But there was a whole lot of them around at the time. So any movement that you might have joined, so Earth First, certainly the ALF were compromised. The Hunt sabotage movement was. I mean, it was easy enough to join a Hunt sab movement. We were open, and as long as we didn't suspect someone, then if you turned up and did the thing, then you were one of us. And as long as we didn't have any suspicions, then we'd go out for a beer afterwards and talk and tell each other about her. She would find out about everyone's lives. So that they were building up this. They weren't necessarily interested in catching criminals. They were interested in building up a background
database or whatever.
Yeah, impression of who's doing what, where they live, why they're doing things. A huge big database. So when and if they needed to clamp down or pay people a visit, they knew where they lived and what their habits were and their routines and all the rest of it. We never knew this.
Did you ever get really highly disgusted by this kind of tactic, or do you think that based on some of the experiences you had that this maybe even rubbed off on this cop, or do cops just not feel anything? Because I'm under the impression cops have no conscience or spine.
It's interesting that you say that. In the case of Christine Green, she was active with the West London Hunt Sabs for about 4 or 5 years. People began to get suspicious, and then she disappeared. So as soon as their time was up, or people began to get suspicious, they would leave a note for the partner that they'd been going out with, or for the people that they'd been living with, saying, "Oh, my uncle has died and left me a lot of money, and I'm going off to Spain for 6 months. I'll see you later." And then they would disappear, and then they would go back to being police again. When Christine Green disappeared, she made contact again with one of the Hunt Sabs, a genuine Hunt Sab from the West London Hunt Sabs, a guy called Tom. She contacted him secretly, and they began a relationship. Absconded from the police with Tom. They moved to, I think it was Dorset. She took part in one of the largest Animal Liberation Front mink liberation raids down in Dorset or something like that, freeing about 6,000 mink. She then went public saying that she had been a police spy. She apologized publicly to the people she'd been spying on, saying they were some of the best people that she'd ever met. And then the Met Police issued a counter to that. They were pissed off with her. She had publicly and disgracefully quit the police force and made public the fact that she was a spy. So the police were shitting themselves, thinking she could be telling all these Hunt Sabs or anarchists all the inner workings of how the whole British spy thing works and all this. She knows it all. She was one of them. Now she's herself and Thomas are believed to be still together. They've dropped out of the animal rights community and of the police fraternity. They're living somewhere in Scotland secretly, and they just want to be left alone. She went native.
God,
And became
what
an
that? That's the best story I've heard all week.
Yeah.
Jesus
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah.
Good.
There was one guy that was like that went native as well. A guy called Chitty something. I can't remember his story in detail. There's a really good book called Undercover, written by two Guardian journalists, and it goes into all these guys' details. It's jaw-dropping. The stuff that they were doing to win credit from the activists, to gain credibility and all the rest of it. They were pulling off some stuff that even activists weren't even doing, in order to impress these people, them to open up to them.
Yeah.
So that's a whole story in itself. I can go on, but it would just dominate for the next hour.
Yeah. No, you're coming back. That's without a doubt. We have to do this again. I mean, when it comes to like COINTELPRO, like the FBI did, you get an infiltrate somebody. This is standard practice. Get somebody infiltrated and make them the craziest. And then they even inspire people. I've read about undercover cops really coaxing in just like lazy stoners into bombing a building.
Yeah,
and it's just so underhanded and
it's so unnecessary. It wouldn't be. It's just they're drumming up the very thing that they claim to be wanting to prevent, and the COINTELPRO program was obviously a lot more fatal for people, and they were killing people and all the rest. Fred Hampton and all that. What they weren't doing was moving in with these people and having sex with them and having babies with them and all the rest of it. The British state, it was a unique flavor. Even the Stasi in East Germany were content to phone tap and spy on people and then arrest them when necessary. But they weren't moving in with them and pretending to be anarchists and, having sex and babies and then just disappearing out of people's lives and all that. It was so dramatic and unbelievable that if you were in an anarchist club at a gig and the craziest guy there sort of came up to you and started telling you about all this prior to it being made public, you'd be going, "You're paranoid. We are nowhere near a threat, as much of a threat to the state for them to be investing this amount of resource and potential bad press if it comes to light on us. We're nothing. We're doing this because we feel we should and no one else is, but it's just small scale stuff." As it turns out, it couldn't have been, because the state were really interested, particularly with the Hunt Sabs. They had a constant stream of spies going into the various groups, particularly around London. The most the Hunt Sabotage group was ever going to do was going to go out, imitate a hunter's horn and voice codes in order to try and save a fox and defend themselves in that process. That's it. It wasn't the Bolsheviks storming the Winter Palace. It wasn't the Black Panthers, following police with shotguns. It was a very benign.
It will be soon if they don't.
Probably, for sure, yeah. But we were like, all we're doing is we're trying to save an animal. We're pissing some people off. Obviously, it's quite antagonistic, but does it merit this amount of attention? The answer was yes.
Obviously, yes. Well, so what do you think deep down under? What do these fascist clowns? What are they really afraid of? Who are they trying to protect?
I think in the case of particularly fox hunting, they don't like having their day's fun spoiled. They have the resources and the ability to get the police to do sort of what they want at no real cost to them, so they do. I think the state also and the police had a concern that the Hunt Sabotage movement might be a breeding ground for more radical activity, which isn't a completely ridiculous notion, but there was no arrests based on that ever, as far as I know. They might have thought it might lead to something more radical, but there wasn't any evidence really of that. In the Hunt Saboteurs Association has been around, I think, almost 60 years, and there's no firm evidence that it's a breeding ground or a training ground for ALF activists. Having said that, a lot of convicted ALF activists started off as Hunt Sabs, but by no means all of them. And I would say most convicted ALF activists have also done animal rights stalls in towns or been on marches. So it wouldn't be just a Hunt Sabotage thing. So it would be unfair to single that out as being responsible for the advent of the ALF,
Yeah.
So why they were so concerned, I think they could afford to be, and it didn't cost them anything. Maybe it was good training for police in spying tactics. they knew that if they were found out by the activists, that they probably wouldn't come to harm. If they had been uncovered while they were spying on the National Front or the British movement, they would have been kicked to death. No, so it's very telling that of the 1,000 or so political groups that were spied upon since 1968 by the British state in Britain and Ireland as well, 3 of them were right wing.
Yeah.
The other 997 were left wing or apolitical groups. So they were, and the reason that they officially gave during the Spy Cops inquiry that they wouldn't go into far right groups was because they were deemed to be too violent, which in my view would be the reason to go in.
Right.
But it was their reason for not going in. They were quite prepared to spy on pacifists and vegans, but they were prepared to spy on hardcore racist thugs.
Pot smokers, yeah. Anybody who's not going to move too quick and is peaceful, we're going to fucking take them down.
Yeah. They know what to say for us.
Right.
You know, so as to why exactly, I don't know, but there is an inquiry that's ongoing. It's on hiatus at the moment. It concludes in 2028, but there's an in-depth inquiry into this whole scandal. It's limited, but it's very interesting. And there's a podcast called Spy Cops Info that has details of the entire thing.
I'm going to check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is underhanded and not necessary, but there's something about police, authority, industrialists, whatever it is, rich people. I'm assuming that these people that were fox hunting were rich.
Ultra rich.
Yeah. Their fascination with power that bleeds over from trying to extract money from all the people and then going off and killing fucking helpless, defenseless animals. These people are diseased. And I think if you look close enough, there's a root problem there that we could all put our finger on. Well, you'll have to come back and do this again.
Oh my God, it's 10 to 10.
Yeah. So what, you come
I've got about 10 minutes. If you're about, I've got to go in about 10 or 12 minutes, but if you're happy to talk a little bit more, and certainly I'll be interested in coming back again. I've barely touched the surface here. There's so much more to talk about.
You come back next week. I don't care. I'm not busy. But yeah, 10 minutes, go, shoot. Give us a lesson.
Okay, so let me think. So what I could talk about, actually, I could tell you what I could talk about the next time, which would be the adventures we had in starting up a hunt sabotage group in the west of Ireland that had never seen any hunt sabotage before. Actually, it had seen it about 150 years earlier. The very first recorded act of hunt sabotage was organized by an Irish priest in Limerick, which is in the west of Ireland, in 1886, when the local landlord, a guy called John Gubbins, who owned the entire area, was threatening to evict some of the tenants. And the local priest, a guy called Father Sheehy, organized a whole load of people from the local hurling team. Do you know hurling? You know, that's sport?
It's a sport, yeah.
But like camogie, but the sticks are they have metal bands. They're a bit more hard. They're a bit more like clubs than camogie sticks. So he organized a local hurling team to prevent the landlord going out hunting, him and his mates from going out hunting for an entire hunting season, which is the winter period, until that hunt folded because he had threatened to evict these tenants. So it wasn't done for the sake of the fox or in the name of animal rights. It was been done to piss off the local landlord's main source of fun, basically. So the idea was to stop him from hunting if he continued to threaten eviction. So that was the first recorded and a successful hunt. The hunt folded at the end of that season. They all sold their horses, and some of them moved to London, and the hunt disbanded. So it was not only the very first hunt sabotage, it was also a highly successful hunt sabotage. But that was in 1886. In 1996, me and a whole lot of friends in the west of Ireland decided to sabotage the local hunt there, who were really vicious people called the Galway Blazers. And we went out 3 times. On the third time, they ambushed us. And I can go into detail. It's a long story, but we had the shit kicked out of us. There was about 20 of us. Got a hammering. Our cars were smashed, in full front of the police. In full view of the police. The whole village came out basically and attacked us. The village that we were near, it wasn't just the Hunts and their supporters, it was the entire redneck village coming out to hang the witches, basically. It was like some sort of pogrom against witches. It was fucking terrifying. And it took place in front of about 6 cops, and they refused to confirm any of this, so we couldn't prosecute, and our SAB group disbanded after that. But I'm happy to say that there was a new SAB group in the west of Ireland now that continued to sabotage that same hunt, the Galway Blazers. So it froze the whole movement for a while, and then I moved to England a few months after that incident. But yeah, it was a terrifying incident, and it set me up for a very confrontational attitude when I was going out sabbing in England with the local group there, who had been through all this many years back and had come out the other side, and there was a informal understanding that if the hunt don't get too heavy with the SABs, then the SABs won't call in all their mates to get really heavy with the hunt the following week. So we can go out and sabotage and not be in too much fear of violence, because there was a system called the regional hit or the national hit. So if a local group of SABs were attacked by their hunts on a given Saturday, they would phone around all the SAB groups in this sort of 100-mile radius and invite all of them along for the next hunt SAB. So instead of there being only 5 or 6 or 10 SABs, there'd be maybe 200 SABs would turn up for a regional hit, and to impress upon the hunt that if you attack these guys, we will come back in force and take revenge, essentially. But we didn't have this sort of backup in Ireland, because it was a nascent, very new movement, and there wasn't the numbers and there wasn't the feistiness. But I went over to England with this class war, hard sort of approach to hunt sabbing, and initially I've been getting really feisty and argumentative, and it's applied to the hunt. And the hunt sabs I was with were a bit standing back going, what the fuck are you doing, Mark? It doesn't need to be like this. We've been through all this many years back, and now there's sort of an understanding. And it was a bit weird for me to get used to that sort of dynamic. It wasn't sheer hatred on both sides. There was they knew our names, first names, all the rest. It had been going on for so long there. It was the hunt that Ronnie Lee used to do way back in the 1970s, and the hunt that the Band of Mercy first practiced their acts of vandalism on. So these guys had been getting sabotaged since the early 70s, and they'd been through all the obvious responses of violence and more violence, and get a security team in and bouncers in, and been through all that, and it had all been defeated by weight of numbers from the saboteurs. And now there was this mutual understanding that we won't attack each other. You're going to go out and hunt, and we're going to go out and hunt SAB, and no one will attack each other. And that's the basis. Obviously, it didn't work all the time. There was quite a bit of violence, but nowhere near as much as I was used to in Ireland. So I had a bit of a rude awakening to understand that dynamic in the history, and how that will shape the rapport that will develop over time, that will evolve between the local police, the local hunt saboteurs, and the local hunt. It will evolve.
Somehow there's a classiness to it, and there's like rules that you don't know that you go in there.
Engagement.
I would be rules of engagement. I would be the same way. I would go in there just wanting to start shit and just be really attack their personal appearance and shit.
Yeah. It was all this I was calling personal ill sons. It was like a football hooligan sort of thing. So, and so I had to temper that down a bit. I had to fit in with the dynamic there. It wasn't about me. It was about there was a much bigger history than me there. So, it was. I can go into detail about that next time, because it's a big long story with a massive fight at the end, basically.
Well, you're gonna come on again. We're gonna tell the story, and we got still the history of hunt saboteur and more like just general history. I know you know your stuff, so we're gonna have you back again. Mark Fitzpatrick from the Vegan Society, also just incredible human being doing what he can do for the animals. Everybody out there, go vegan. Anything you want to add before we go?
I'm looking forward to talking to you next week, because there's so much history to talk about, and it's fascinating.
My schedule's open for a guy like you always. Wave goodbye to everybody. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.